got a very large picture of a woman who is not doing anything, and little ones are, I don't know, maybe she's going to be the first speaker.
It is sort of fact specific.
Me. Sorry. Mimi, we are ready.
Welcome. I hope you can all hear me. Fantastic. Welcome everyone to the Humor platform. This is the Humor book launch series. This is our third book launch series session. For those that are new to Humor, just a little bit of background. So Humor is the Institute for Humanities in Africa, launched in 2010, which intends to create a space for dynamic interdisciplinary community and scholars in the humanities and other disciplines. It's within the Faculty of Humanities at UCT, University of Cape Town. And it's an innovative research hub that opens new areas of inquiry, establishing strong connections between scholars within the Institute, the UCT, nationally, and other institutes elsewhere. So the book launch series is part of our numerous activities outside of our research development, which encourages networking, knowledge exchange, and the celebration of emerging and new books that are coming from scholars writing on different topics. And today we have a special book from Professor I'm going to try to say her name correctly. Olufunmilayo Arewa, also known as Funmi. So I'm just going to say Funmi. So Funmi is a professor of business and transactional law at Temple University in the US. She has a master's and PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley, an advanced master's in economics from Michigan, a Juris Doctor from Harvard, and an AB from Harvard College. Her research focuses on technology, music, film, business, and African studies. Before becoming a law professor, she practiced law for nearly 10 years, working in legal and business positions in the entrepreneurial and technology startup arena, including law firms and companies in Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York. And she was also a visiting lecturer at the Center for Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, and served as a Foreign Service Officer in the United States Department of State in Washington, DC. She's also served as vice chair in Nigeria Copyright Expert Working Group, working on projects relating to education, scientific and technology capacity in Africa. And she has served as a lead consultant for some projects that examine the feasibility of establishing venture capital funds in the Eastern Caribbean. In 2019, she was a fellow of the Kate Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in Humanities at the University of Bonn. And she has also served as a vice chair for the Nigeria Copyright Expert Working Group. And in addition to writing about music, Funmi also has studied classical voice for many years. Today, she is presenting on her new book, which is called Disrupting Africa, Technology, Law, and Development, which examines the intersections between technology, digital technology, and other complex areas in Africa, including Nigeria, the protests, the EndSARS protests in Nigeria. And this discussion will also be joined by discussants, one of which is Rogers O'Rourke. He's a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Witwatersrand. He has a research background in elites, governance, development, and political leadership in Central Africa. His research also covers themes of conflict and suspicion in French-African relations. And another discussant we have is Bill Mara, who's currently serving as the Dean of the Social Sciences at the University of California. He has conducted research on money, economy, finance, and law, including offshore financial services industry in the Caribbean. He has also covered topics such as cryptocurrencies, Islamic finance and mobile money, Bitcoin and blockchain technologies. And this is going to be a very fruitful discussion on money. And thank you so much for being here. We look forward to a fruitful discussion on this new publication. And over to you, Funmi. We'd like to hear more about your new book. Congratulations.
Wonderful. Thank you for that kind introduction. I would like to start out by thanking Huma and the IMTFI for sponsoring this book launch. And I also wanted to note that this is the first talk in of talks that are sponsored jointly by Huma and IMTFI. Sibel Kusimba will be giving a talk in the near future, so you should watch for that announcement. I also wanted to thank Jenny Fan for making this happen and for being a key force behind this collaboration. So what I'm going to do is start out by talking a bit about the book, and then I'm going to talk about, I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try, I can't tell you unfortunately too much. I encourage you to buy it so you can learn all about it. There's a discount code that is being circulated today. So digital era technologies in Africa, more specifically, my focus is Nigeria, are a key starting point for my research. So I try to engage with narratives surrounding technology, particularly what I refer to as technology uplift narratives. And a lot of the technology uplift narratives we see reflect a very optimistic view about technology. So one of the arguments you'll see people make is that digital era technologies may enable African countries to leapfrog and narrow gaps, development gaps between Africa and the rest of the world. However, contexts of technology usage today reflect a collision of past and current paths and visions of the future. And in the book, I talk a bit about how NSARS sort of exemplifies and highlights this collision. It highlights the impact of youth in Nigeria and other countries in Africa today. The current demographics suggest that populations in a number of African countries will double or even triple by the end of the century. At the same time, we have what I refer to as a pervasive scarcity of opportunity in many places, where there are limited jobs and other opportunities. At the same time, so youth are very engaged in technology, as the NSARS protests have shown, often very engaged with technologies to a greater extent than many of their elders. And I think one way to look at NSARS is that it's a conflict about governance. We see youth who are demanding perhaps changes in approaches, and rulers that are in many instances in Nigeria historically have reflected strong authoritarian elements. In my book, I trace back how some of those elements from a legal perspective are a legacy of colonial legal arrangements. So what I suggest in my book is that existing legal and policy approaches suggest that technology uplift narratives need greater scrutiny. And I actually start out thinking about a quote from Muna Ndulo, who basically says in one of his articles that dreams of post-independence prosperity and self-rule have become the nightmare of insecurity and poverty in too many places in Africa. So this book, the focus and origins of this book is based on, to a significant degree, on archival research, primarily in the British National Archives, but I've also done a brief amount of research in the French Overseas Archives as well, because my follow-on book to this will probably be comparative. So what this book looks at is the external and internal and legal and policy context. And it looks at what I call the continuing implications of what I refer to as external determination in Nigeria and other former British colonies, which have hybrid common law legal traditions. The book really focuses on patterns of borrowing established prior to and during colonialism and continued after formal colonialism ended. And what I really talk about is the extent to which, especially in law, we see cut and paste borrowing processes in the legal arena, where laws are just taken during colonialism. Their colonial records reflect just verbatim copying of usually English law, but also it could be law from other colonies without sufficient engagement with local contexts. So this has continuing implications. And actually, this is partly an outgrowth of my music scholarship, which focuses a lot on borrowing. So I originally became curious about the origins of law in the Nigerian context when I was looking at a provision of the Companies Act in Nigeria, Company and Allied Matters Act in Nigeria, which governs companies or corporations, basically things that we refer to as corporations. And I was really curious about the origins of one specific provision. I didn't understand why it was in a law in Nigeria, because it didn't make sense in a developing country to really have this provision in the law. So that initial question, as it turns out, this provision in the Nigerian Company and Allied Matters Act, which notably was revised last year after 30 years, this was the 1990 Act, reflected an old version of a UK law that was not actually updated when the UK removed that provision from the UK law. In fact, I think this provision was removed from the UK law probably 20 years ago. Now the 2020, the new Nigerian Company and Allied Matters Act, this provision was particularly a negative one for startup companies and small and emerging companies, small businesses. The 2006 reforms, amendments in the UK eliminated some of those more favorable things. But this legal provision highlighted to me the extent to which many laws in Nigeria, particularly in the commercial law arena, reflect a pervasive and continuing cut and paste borrowing practices that are problematic. So I first of all want to talk about this concept of external determination. So basically, in the book, I talk about how patterns of borrowing and legal policy decision-making reflect a predominance of external powers, external agents, external funding, and external needs in contexts where the local is all too often ignored or put aside. And this is not just a historical relic of a continuing past. Of a colonial past. There was an open letter published last week in the journal Nature Medicine, which I think highlights what I'm talking about. This was an open letter to the editors, and it talks about a $30 million grant that was awarded to the nonprofit health organization PATH by the US government's President's Malaria Initiative. And this grant funded a consortium of 7 institutions in the US, the UK, and Australia to support African countries in the improved use of data for decision-making in malaria control and elimination. The authors of this open letter note that not one African institution was named in the press release. And they note that even though the past year has seen a lot of calls about in the public health arena for more equality and inclusion, the absence of African institutions from this is part of a continuing pattern. The authors go on to note that once global fund contributions are removed, 81% of the funding, US spent $1.1 billion on malaria, USA, UK, and Canada spent $1.1 billion on malaria development aid. 81% was used to support institutions in the funding country, and 18% went to non-governmental organizations, probably based in high-income countries, which leaves 1% of malaria funding available to local in-country research institutions. And they go on to say, we recognize that the current funding structures create an imbalance of power and a monopoly that favors Western institutions and is derived in part from the perpetuation of inequities in access to funding with policies that lock out African institutions. So in my book, I highlight how these continuing patterns of local exclusion are a consequence of colonialism, and more importantly, they're deeply embedded in the law itself in ways that will require legal reform to really address. The title of my book is Disrupting Africa: Technology, Law, and Development. And the disruption is about disrupting these patterns of cut and paste borrowing and external determination in order to have true local empowerment and true attention to local contexts. Now, I'm going to end by talking about what are some of the implications of this external determination. One is there's a valorization of the external, which means this leads to insufficient value attributed to the local and the internal. This is often the case by external powers, but it's also sometimes the case internally. As Frantz Fanon noted, all colonized people, in other words, people in whom an inferiority complex has taken root, whose local cultural originality has been committed to the grave, we see that if we just look at things like intellectual property law in Nigeria, we see insufficient valorization of the internal relative to the external. You also see patterns of, and that reflects patterns of mental colonization that I don't have time to talk about further. We also see continuing questionable legal processes and poor outcomes. Now, the questionable legal processes are not something new. One of the striking things about colonialism was the extent to which the colonial authorities who were responsible for making law with virtually no local input just copied things. One of my favorite examples is in 18th century England, there were laws about poachers and brigands that put burnt cork on their face so that their faces wouldn't gleam in the night. And statutes actually addressed what should you do in England if people have cork on their face at night. So when they copied these criminal law statutes in many African countries, as Robert Seidman notes, more than one African penal code copied British statutes and accordingly made it a felony to be found wandering about at night with intent to commit a felony with one's face blackened. Now, that just highlights the extent to which there was very little or no attention, certainly insufficient attention to the actual local context within which legal decisions were made. And this is particularly true in colonies. Most African colonies were not dominions. Notably, South Africa was a dominion, so there's slightly different legal experience with the dominions. Other dominions were countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So in countries like Nigeria, there was really just a cut and paste approach. And in my review of colonial records, I see very little examples of real attention to local people. This meant that there was insufficient consideration of the local and legal and policy contexts. Local people were almost invisible. To the extent they were considered, it was usually in very stereotypic ways, stereotypic and often demeaning ways. Now, where I want to focus my remaining 6 seconds is on what incentives did these patterns create for elite intermediaries. One of the things that we need to think about is the implications for digital economy elites, elite practices and elite models of the profusion of technologies we see today. One thing to note is colonial governance looked a lot like corporations in that they were focused on cost minimization, thin staffing, what some people refer to as the thin white line, which led to significant reliance on intermediaries. Now, those intermediaries had a very curious status. Their status was raised by virtue of their selection and validation by external powers. Some of the incentives that started during colonialism have continued after colonialism. Particularly in the book, I talk about what I refer to as jurisdictional arbitrage and elite extraction. So colonialism offered opportunities for intermediaries to profit from differences between European derived legal systems and existing local legal approaches. Elizabeth Colson noted a long time ago that how internal contestation played out in the development of customary land law, particularly in contexts where scarcity became a factor, and people became aware of the conflict between the old political obligation to maintain general access to adequate resources for all citizens and the possibility of extracting an individual profit from areas preempted under the rule that a man might enjoy the fruits of his labor. Now, these conflicts between the externally derived legal systems and internal legal systems often accrued to the benefit of certain elites who took advantage of those differences and profited from them. That's what I refer to as jurisdictional arbitrage. It's a way of extracting profit internally, often by elites. This was not sufficiently checked during colonialism, and it led to questionable incentives that are baked in institutionally today in many respects. So I'll stop there. I went a little over time. Thank you. I look forward to our comments and discussion.
Thank you so much, Funmi. I think your book really does demonstrate how lawmaking and these legal processes during colonialism continue to frame these contexts in digital technologies, how they are created and regulated and used in Africa today. And I just like to emphasize, because of this important text, this launch that is happening at this moment is a joint launch between HUMA and the Institute for Money, Technology and Financial Exclusion. And this institute, it was established in 2008 at the Social Sciences School at the University of California. And it is one of the leading research centers in the consumer side of financial technology and mobile money to AI-driven credit scoring. So this is why we're having a joint launch between HUMA and the IMTFI. And this book is very pertinent in this special new project that the IMTFI is launching, which is called Money, Technology and New Elites. And stay tuned, and we will move forward with the program. And I will request Rogers or Rock to contribute to the discussion and hear what he has to say.
All right. Thank you very much. And I'd like to start by thanking Funmi and Divine for the opportunity to discuss and share our thoughts on what is clearly an evolving situation with regards to the interesting developments on the question of digitality and elites, and how is it that we're engaging with these evolutions. And Funmi is really offering us a lot of material to begin a conversation from a historical, but also very much from the contemporary moment. So, I mean, from what Funmi was talking about, one of the things that is clear is that we live at a time when there are struggles over the meanings of law, digital transformations, and the kinds of political forms emanating from those transformations, right? So, in my view, and I think it's the sense that Funmi also intends to convey, the NSAS protests that we witnessed last year spotlight in a very profound way the kind of conflagration that we were witnessing over questions of wealth, questions of material consumption, issues around appearances, surfaces, versus, you know, what lies presumably underneath. So we all, if we took the time to think about it, many of the youths claim that they were victims of police brutality because the police would suspect them for owning cars of certain values, dressing in a particularly ostentatious fashion, owning iPhones. So at the core of these processes are obviously questions of wealth, and I think and material consumption. And I think in a way the chapter that I read highlights the colonial, very interesting colonial origins on some of these. So I would like to take the time that I have, maybe 7 more minutes, to discuss what I think are three crucial, in my view, three crucial points to enter the conversation. The first is, what is it about this digital moment? It's also for me what I call the moment of Insta virality. That means that everyone wants to become a virus of some sort, right? So people want to be viral. Virality in and of itself has become a kind of currency. So in other words, the digital age also means a particular way of living technopolitics. Is what I'm trying to say with the notion of Insta virality. And the interesting point about this is the kinds of generational struggles that are involved on this question of Insta virality, or the technopolitics of generational struggles at this point. So that is the first point that I found striking, because at the core of these generational struggles are questions of inequality that are very deep, but also status anxiety, and particularly also the divide between the young and the old, the men and the women, so gender struggles as well. And obviously also at the end, sexual struggles, because at this time, it's also a space of freedom. Digital politics is opening up different kinds of spaces of struggle and opportunities to articulate those struggles. For instance, queer and trans communities in Africa, and particularly in Nigeria. Now, but if we step back from that immediate vantage that I am talking about, which is the landscape of digital transformation and the politics, the technopolitics at its center, we are also then offered a window in the book that Funmi presents to us, a window into what I will call the colonial basis of elites in Africa, but particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think an striking part of for me in reading this book is what Funmi describes in really interesting ways as a kind of social apartheid, if you like, or social separation that is happening and has always been there, but perhaps has been deepened over time between the elites and the masses, or the social body from which the elites come from. So that, as she puts it, in interesting ways, what one notices is that from the onset, the African elite thought that its elite status could only have meaning if it was framed, embedded in, and recognized within a Western cultural paradigm. And that is in a way that the African elite sought to be the colonial, to assume, or at least look like the colonial administrator, or the missionary, whichever figure represented colonial, if you like, colonial status in that sense. So that in a way, the legitimacy of the African elite is embedded in the quest for Western legitimation, so that it is the Western norms and values that ultimately for them matters more. Now, if that is the case, I think I would like to end on my third point, which is that there are profound implications in terms of the relationship between digitality and technopolitics in this moment, considering the colonial context that we have been talking about. So the first for me is on this question of the kind of critique that one can bring to questions of power and inequality and wealth. The important thing one notices with this question of elite affinity for Western values and Western norms and Western patterns of consumption, and particularly the desire to separate themselves from the majority. There's a kind of status anxiety to separate themselves from the rest of society, is that the overwhelming reality of eliteness in Africa is its externalization, right? So it's its extroversion, what Jean-Francois Bayard called it extroversion. So that in the end, what is really profound in the way that African elites live their eliteness for the most part is their orientation towards the outside, and upwardness, so that it is not an elite that seeks to go downward and deeper into its society. It is an elite that seeks to escape from its society. So that is very important for a second point. And the second point is that we are all aware of corruption and the misappropriation. Let us say that the material basis that will form the consumption patterns of this elite. But what one finds out is that these elites, because they consume Western, they are oriented towards the West, they are oriented towards outside. What is interesting is that they are now an elite that is mostly global, but not embedded in their society. So many of the elites in Nigeria, for instance, where Funmi's work is set, is that most of its elite have some kind of interest, vested interest abroad. So they own property in Dubai, in Washington, in London, and remarkable stories abound, for instance, of elites who will stay in Nigeria and order pizza in London, so that they don't order, it doesn't really confer legitimacy and value to order a pizza in Lagos, but it makes sense to spend millions of naira to order pizza from London and have DHL deliver it to you. So for me, that is an interesting point. But then it has the implications for the last point I would like to make. Given this situation, how do Africans hold their elites accountable? Because an elite that really cares mostly about the outside, is invested in the outside and has its locus of attention outside. How do you hold that kind of elite accountable? What are the possibilities that are offered? And here, the digital aspects comes back very crucially in terms of what we have seen. I think Nigeria is very notorious for the ways that its elites have kept a lot of wealth in for instance, places like the UK. We had the recent case of the governor, James Ibori and Alison Madueke, but perhaps the most notable one is what has come to be called the Abacha loot, where billions of naira, sometimes even billions of dollars, are said to be in Western banks. What this means in the end is that the structures for accountability within African societies themselves in relation to their elites are very, very, very thin. And therefore that Africans will then have to pursue their elites right on to up to the various global capitals in which these elites have set themselves up. So Madueke is being pursued by the UK justice system, but it depends a lot on the activism and pressure of Nigerian activists, both in the UK and in Nigeria itself. And most often than not, this pursuit of accountability is mediated by the digital. In the end, for me, this book offers very interesting starting points for exploring really deep questions about the relationship between technology and politics today on the African continent. But that also leaves me with one, perhaps just one question that I would like to have a discussion with Funmi on. That is notably that I note that the framing of the book is deeply bound to conceptions of the inside and the outside. It follows, of course, from what I have just said, that in the end, it is a question of the local versus the global, the external versus the internal. If so, because I didn't read the entire book, I'm not clear how this structures the argument for the whole book to begin with. And to the extent that that is the case, I wonder what mediates how she frames or thinks about the ways that technology mediates this distance between the inside, the outside, the external versus the internal, the local and the global. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rogers, for that nice reflection and pertinent questions. I think for me, what resonates is your question on the social apartheid, how deep social apartheid can go within this context of technopolitics. Could I ask Bill, could we have your reflection on the book, please, while we still have some time?
Yes, and thank you so much, Mimi, for facilitating this, and thanks to Divine and Jenny as well. And Funmi, thank you for the book, and congratulations. And I see that the information on the book is in the chat now if people want to get a copy. And what I want to do is actually start with a line from the proposal about the study of elites, the study that we're also launching today. And just one short line, quote, although many think of the digital economy as embodying new things, digital economy activities carry with them long-standing patterns of discrimination and models of elite behavior, unquote. And I think that, as you just heard Rogers talk about as well, one of the interesting puzzles raised by Funmi's book, from an anthropological perspective and a historical perspective, is how we recognize and understand those long-standing patterns and models, and how we understand their connection to new forms, to new models. How do they get taken up or transformed? How are they bolstered? What translations take place in the meantime? And what opportunities do people, elite and otherwise, find for their own agency along the way? Now, I'm going to put this in the context of some of the work that's been done on mobile money over the past 10 years by myself and folks who were here with us, like Vivian Jokoro, who I think is here, and Sibel Kusimba, who I saw earlier. We've long noticed these differences across the continent of Africa in how mobile money is understood and gets taken up. So Vivian Jokoro in Ghana had people tell her, oh, mobile money is something for rich people, indicating a kind of commentary on mobile money and hierarchy. Whereas in Kenya, Sibel Kusimba's work mapped out all of these horizontal networks, mainly of women who would use mobile money quite literally to mobilize and activate relationships in those networks. And we've long speculated that these differences have to do with some of these historical patterns in the relationship between different kinds of elites and different kinds of subordinates. Hierarchies of rank in Ghana, as opposed to kind of bride wealth type relationships involving kind of senior women trying to call the shots in the particular cases that Sibel talks about in East Africa. The challenge, though, is to think about how to think about those differences given the social, political, and economic formations that Funmi described in her book, especially the shifts in elite status and elite self-understanding during and after colonialism. In Ghana and Nigeria, as Funmi shows, elites formed a kind of comprador class who found ways to maintain their elite status by tethering themselves to the colonial order and to its symbols. In the process, they became key intermediaries or brokers who were able to get things done for themselves while skimming off the colonial state. And then Funmi sort of tracks this forward in time in the post-colonial period as well. One really interesting thing here about the law, I think, and Funmi talks about this in the book, is how British colonials and then elite Nigerians invoked European feudal law as they imposed a new legal system in Africa. And it was this kind of idea that the colonized parts of Africa were sort of somehow just like feudal Europe. And so all the things that had to happen in feudal Europe to bring about modernity were the things that then colonial officials and local elites would institute. And one of the things, though, is that it does leave open the question of what everybody else was doing, like how non-elites, how people under elites found avenues or not to assert their own agency, to get their own things done. We know from the work of law professor Rick Abel that when British officials set up courts, there was suddenly a huge increase in misdemeanor crime that was brought before the court. And this had been a thing that had long puzzled observers. Why all of a sudden, when you open a court, are there hundreds and hundreds of cases that just happened just like that? And Abel showed that that big increase was really a product of everyday people, non-elites, essentially trying their luck in this new court system whenever they had a dispute, since they knew what would happen if they just resorted to traditional dispute resolution processes or left things up to familial elders, right? They knew what they were going to get if they did it the old way. So they're like, well, let's try this new thing and see if that gets us what we want, if that helps me resolve my dispute in a way favorable to me. And so what's interesting here is, this wasn't an increase in criminality. It also wasn't really capitulation to colonial law, because these folks weren't, in a sense, saying, yes, we are subject to colonial law and we will submit to its institutions. They were saying, what can I get if I go to this forum as opposed to that forum? The same kind of jurisdictional shopping or jurisdictional arbitrage that Funmi describes for elites. And the British imposition of law here was also, as Funmi shows, an imposition of an imagination of Africa as feudal Europe, which I just mentioned. And this made sense to the British insofar as they understood conflicts between themselves and colonized subjects and conflicts among colonized subjects as conflicts over resources, over land and treasure. But for many across sub-Saharan Africa, those conflicts were understood as over social obligations, not land. This was perplexing to colonial administrators who couldn't get out from underneath their own imposition of feudal categories of land ownership to understand what what a village headman owed to those interlocking social relationships, quote unquote, beneath him. And I was reminded here of the Uganda proverb that crops up in a lot of the anthropology of law of this period. A chief does not rule land, but people. And the colonial officials quite often missed that. And they thought that the chief had a kind of territorial jurisdictionality instead. This situation of legal pluralism after colonialism permitted elites some room for maneuver, Funmi shows, if they were willing to give up the singular attachment to those subtending social relationships and engage in the jurisdictional arbitrage and blocking that she discusses. And this also shifted the terrain of politics. And the term legal pluralism probably doesn't capture well enough the power dimension in play here in the allowable room for maneuver and who had the ability to actually do so. But I think it's important to remember that when we're looking at what the elites were doing, we need to remember that those under them also did have strategies. Now, Funmi leaves us with this very critical and challenging question at the end, which is, this is like the super hard question of the whole thing. How do we imagine an alternative future, essentially? The question is, what are the alternative paths to something that we might call freedom and rights, given the very colonial origins and imposition of those very categories in the colonial process? What will be, she writes of, what will be African liberation if the liberal political and economic ideals embedded in that term demand expropriation and enslavement? And to bring it fast forward to where we are now, in a world of digital exclusion, algorithmic bias, what are the terms for rethinking what she calls the colonial hangover? What terms are even possible for a true anti-racist and decolonial order that doesn't recapitulate those liberal terms of colonial law? Perhaps it's time to let go of some of our liberal dreams for liberalism and see what else might grow. And again, Funmi, thanks so much for the book. It was really great to read. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rogers. Thank you, Bill, for your contributions. O'Rourke raised several questions, including the implications of digitality and technopolitics, social apartheid being deepened by this context. And thank you so much, Bill, for raising these important points. And finally, ending on that question, whether it's time to let go of this liberal dream that imposes algorithmic bias, systems of digital exclusion. Funmi, what is your response to those two presentations?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank both Rogers and Bill for their really insightful comments. I would say one thing that I think ties both of their commentary together is that I think one thing we see is that, I first of all want to answer Roger's question about the internal and external, the local and the global. In the book elsewhere, I acknowledge that these are constructs that are intended to get us to think about how law is structured. They're constantly shifting. The local and the global, the internal and the external is constantly shifting. And I think in the era of technology really challenges our conceptions of borders and internal and external, because it unfolds in ways that is different than in a world where things were sort of all tangible and based on territory. So I think technology challenges those. The thing that I think is interesting is that thinking about the internal and external highlights the extent to which there's sort of a border, liminal space between how people conceptualize the internal and external, the global and the local, acknowledging that where that border is has shifts in time and space. And I think one of the things I think that Rogers mentioned is status anxiety. I think that shifting border may actually reinforce status anxiety, because people want to be on one side, especially elites want to be perceived as, want to be in that external facing category to some extent. I think it's also something that also ties both comments together is that people behave strategically in various contexts, not just elites, but local people in going to different courts. And I think one of the biggest problems, I think, with laws implemented during colonialism is that it, to a significant degree, ignored the strategic aspects of behavior that were likely to unfold when you put in place a new legal system without thinking about how does it relate to the old one. Now, from a legal perspective, that's partly a concept of conflict of law. Like, so when English law was brought in Nigeria, there was really no robust conflict of law doctrine to govern when should a dispute go to a certain place. And that's because they had a very racialized conception of law. It wasn't always explicitly in the law itself, but they saw customary law to a significant degree as being for natives and English law as being for Europeans. And to some extent, they sometimes incorporated elites into that category, and often were very puzzled by people that weren't European or weren't African. So people that they refer to as Syrians, mostly Lebanese, they were very puzzled about where they fit in. But I think strategic behaviors and agency are really key to thinking about how do we move forward, because I think some of the incentives that were created during colonialism continue to be the basis for how law continues to be made and how people interact with what they perceive to be the external. And I think if we can think about how do you disrupt those past patterns, that can be a good way to answer Bill's question about, in an era of algorithmic bias and widespread technology usage, how do we actually think about restructuring relations in a different way? I think it requires acknowledging and disrupting those past patterns. So I could talk about this for hours, but I want to leave it open for discussion. But thank you. Thanks again to both Rogers and Bill for your really insightful comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Funmi. I mean, for me, I think that, yeah, it's as academics, it's easy to ask the question whether saying that we need to rethink these structures of power and thinking alternatively, but on the ground, I mean, how feasible would it be to really have impact on such legislation that seems to have boxed people in certain ways? I think that's a struggle I have personally, just thinking about how disconnected or how unfeasible it might be. Not sure whether you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the need is pressing because I don't think the current situation is sustainable. When you look at just the demographic changes that we're going to see in the next 30 to 40 years, I think NSARS and a lot of protests that we're seeing on the ground today highlight the fact that we're in the middle of a significant population growth in Africa. Now that can be a demographic dividend or it can be a demographic disaster. I do think it requires rethinking these approaches and thinking about how can we make the future look different from the past. I don't think what the current situation on the ground is really sustainable in many countries.
Yeah.
Certainly, I don't think it's sustainable in Nigeria without serious societal chaos and or disturbances.
Yeah. And Bill and Rogers, what's your take on that? Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we open the floor to questions?
From Rogers, not really. I think in the Q&A we'll have,
okay.
I think we'll have a chance to pick up on some of this.
Okay. Well, we have a question from John Keith Hart. John Keith, would you like to ask the question personally, or would you like me to read it out for you? Let me see whether I can see everyone. Okay, I will just read out his questions. He says that who are the interests shaping, for example, commercial law in African countries today? In Nigeria, why do local economic, bureaucratic, and political cadres play no part in shaping laws? Why is colonial law more powerful still than corporations and international organizations who work together to develop transnational legal norms?
That's a great question. I didn't actually talk much about this part of the book. I don't think it's the colonial laws themselves alone that really shape things. It's a process that was established during colonialism about how you make laws and how you incorporate the local in lawmaking. James Gatti has a really interesting book that I think is coming out later this year, where he has a chapter about the Kenyan company law reforms. And he talks about how there were two visions. One vision was externally oriented. You had a group of elites that were externally oriented that would adopt laws in essentially the same way that laws were adopted during colonialism. And then you had a group that was really focused on looking more internally and had a very different approach to how they should reform, how the law should be reformed. And as it turned out in the chapter that he sent me, the external facing group won, and you had a pattern that looks very similar to patterns of lawmaking during and after colonialism. So the question is not just what the laws are themselves, but the process by which you come to having a law made. And I think we often see, whether it's some kind of international legal model, whether it's some kind of model law, whether it's a reform of an existing law, often the examples that are taken are externally derived and not sufficiently customized for local context. And this has big implications for local people that want to just start everyday businesses. It has big implications for my ability to actually scale my business, and I'm not talking about the kind of large scale technology companies, even everyday companies that where people want to just do something that's smaller scale. It becomes more difficult. Now, the CAMA 2020 reforms in Nigeria were said to be intended to facilitate small business. And that's been a persistent problem with many of the legal frameworks, because the English laws they copied did not incentivize small business. And that was just a problem, a gap, and oversight in the original English laws. And I think that is something we need to think about when we think about borrowing. When you borrow a law, laws come from a cultural, political context, and they reflect compromises, discussions, debates. It's when you import that law without really customizing it for local context, you really sometimes that leads to a certain kind of mismatch between the law itself and the local context within which that law will unfold. And that contributes to what many people talk about in terms of the gap between law as written and law in practice in many African countries, certainly in Nigeria, because there's many, many laws. Colonial authorities were very good at passing laws, but they weren't really customized. Many of those laws are still on the books. And even if the laws themselves aren't on the books, often the legal processes reflect that legacy in ways that I think need to be reformed.
Indeed.
Can I follow up just a little bit?
Sure, John.
What the point I'm trying to make is that the transnational corporations supported by international organizations like the ILO, WTO, and so forth are operating on a global scale, and they don't want to be made subject to national laws. I mean, in other words, to adapt their practices to the laws of every country they work in. And so they have been developing for the last 30 years. I've taken part in at least 3 different exercises of this kind. They've been developing, what they want is for national governments to police commercial laws, let's say, or labor laws, but they don't want them to write them. Because, I mean, there are 54 countries in Africa. They couldn't adapt to the particular labor laws and commercial laws of every country they're operating in, at least so they claim. So it seems to me that this emphasis on the persistence of colonial law is missing a new global order that has been developing for many years, and which has just as little interest in national governments or interests forming the laws that they would have to respond to. That's I'd be very interested in your reply to that.
Yeah, that's actually not what I say in the book. I'm not saying that it's the colonial laws themselves.
You were saying it.
Yeah, I think it's the colonial processes, and it might not be. It might be a state actor today. It might be an NGO. It might be a multilateral organization, but it's the same kind of process where you don't really focus on the local. So I see that as a process that reflects the same kind of colonial overhang and with respect to the relationship between the external and internal. We may have shifting external powers. They may be global powers today. It might be multinational corporations. But so that's a first response. The second response is I don't think that I don't accept the argument that they can't accommodate different local regimes, because they do it all over the world. They have very sophisticated ways of dealing with different types of local law in different contexts. So I think the global problem, the global claim that they can't do that, I think just can be pushed back on. The other issue, though, is even in regimes, let's think about intellectual property, for instance, even in regimes where there's more latitude for local agency to change things. In many African countries, for instance, in intellectual property, don't take full advantage of the exceptions and limitations available to them that are embedded in global instruments, which are certainly externally determined. Even within the external determined context, there may be room for local strategies and local maneuvering and local initiatives. In those contexts, many African countries don't take advantage of even those things that are available. So I think this partly has to do with the vision of law and the vision of how the local should be embedded in the law. And I think that is an overhang from colonialism. And I think that does need to be changed, because I think we are in a context where many countries in Africa have significant external global influences from various sources, including the multinational corporations you mentioned, international organizations that establish these norms that are basically in many cases reflect norms that come out of developed countries. So I think there are two things to think about. One is the origin of those norms, which I think needs to be pushed back on to some extent. But even within those initiatives, sometimes there's room for local initiative that's often not taken.
Yeah, that's a very good response from me. Thank you for that clarification. We are running out of time, and could I ask Chikezi? Chikezi has a question. Chikezi is one of our postdoctoral fellows at HUMA. Go ahead, Chikezi.
Hi, Funmi Bawoni. Hi. Congratulations on your book. I think it's a great. I think it's a great crisscross of ethnography, technology, and law. My question is from the point of view of because part of my research is I'm interested in young people and technology, especially in the Nigerian context. So I was thinking whether in your book, if you have any reflections on the possibilities that you find that the EndSARS protests highlighted or engineered, especially with regards to young people and the power of technology to break political or legal hegemonies. Around the overall techno-optimist perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're still seeing that unfold. So I think in some ways, yes and no, based on what we've seen to date. I mean, I think the Nigerian government was probably very surprised at how the EndSARS protesters were able to organize themselves and, more importantly, fund themselves. I think the role of the feminist coalition in providing funds, and then when the Nigerian government shut down bank accounts, they then switched to cryptocurrency. So I think we're seeing a back and forth, because I think EndSARS is about the youth protesting the governance that they see that reflects this colonial overhang that I discussed. But we're seeing a back and forth right now. So we saw organization of protests. We saw some killings of protesters, which I think brought a lot of visibility, which was tragic, and brought a lot of visibility to the protests themselves. We see the government trying to, putting members of the feminist coalition on a no-fly list. So we're seeing the back and forth, shutting down bank accounts, which they switched to cryptocurrency. And I think it's not coincidental that last month, even after the Nigerian SEC basically started a regulatory process to call cryptocurrency a security last year, the Nigerian central bank, in February, actually essentially banned cryptocurrency in Nigeria. And I think some of this is about control and it's about authority. So we're seeing that technology does enable paths that may enable people to step outside these structures that constrain them in many ways, both economically and politically. However, the government in Nigeria, in many respects, is that colonial state. It has a lot of centralized power. And the question, which raises questions about devolution that I don't get into so much in the book, but I think technology, is challenging things. That's why in many African countries, one of the first responses to protests is internet shutdowns, because there's a recognition that technology is changing the equation a little bit. Now, where that will end up at the end of the day, it's hard to say. My sense is that I see two potential paths. One potential path is a more liberal path where you have more freedom, in a sense, for people within many African countries with the prospects of more financial prosperity. The other path I see is maybe dystopic, where you see more control, where you see a ruler that might actually understand technology, that decides to really shut down and maintain this kind of authoritarian pattern that we've seen express itself in various ways in Nigeria.
Thank you. Thanks.
Wonderful. We have a comment from Sanya. Can I ask that try and make it a little bit short? We're running out of time. Sanya is one of our research fellows at HUMA. Your microphone is off, Sanya.
Good evening, and thanks for that interesting presentation, and which talks a lot about a certain, I think, aspect of what the legal dispensation is in Nigeria, the colonial relation and the post-colonial situation. I think you do very well in exploring those connections, the local and the global, the internal and the external. But I also think that we should reflect a bit on the other side, the Sharia legal code, which is gaining ascendance in many parts of Nigeria, basically the northern part. And you have a strong Mediterranean outlook in that part of the country. So you have about perhaps 11 states that subscribe to the Sharia code, and it's totally different from what exists in the most southern parts of the country. And because the political elites in Nigeria tend to be most of the time northern origin, we do have that kind of outlook gaining prominence. And then you do have the transnational connections, which is quite different from what exists in the southern parts and then in the rest of the northern hemisphere. So I'd like to know what you think about this aspect of the Nigerian legal configuration and political dispensation, in which we do have this very two prominent dichotomies about how you view law, how you view life, how you view, the world, and many times they're in conflict.
Yes, I talk about it not in the segment that I submitted for this. I talk about the implementation of Sharia law in northern Nigeria, and I think it raises questions that I think are consistent with other themes in the book. The first question it raises is the extent to which legal frameworks are actually effective. And I think that part of the appeal of Sharia law is that there is a sense, and this goes back because in Lagos in the 19th century, there was a petition sent to the British colonial officials by Muslims in Lagos who wanted to have Sharia law imposed, and the British said no. You can't. We can have English law and we can have traditional law, but they basically didn't approve the petition. I think part of what we're talking about is conflicting legal regimes within the same country, and to a significant degree, Islamic law, English law was the supreme law to the extent there were any conflicts of law. And this goes back to the fact that one of the biggest, I think, problems with colonialism, there wasn't sufficient attention to conflicts of laws. And there's still pervasive conflicts of laws between English law derived systems and local law systems in Nigeria, for instance, in the area of marriage, where I had a big section about marriage that I had to take out because I was over word count. But I think the Islamic law in northern Nigeria, I think, reflects a response to that legal requirement, that legal environment, and also reflects an inattention to questions of conflicts of law, because there are some conflicts between some would assert there's some conflicts between the Nigerian constitution and some of the Sharia law that's been imposed in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, northern Nigerian states. The other issue that's really interesting is we also saw the input of the external there, because there was involvement from the Islamic world in the implementation of Sharia law in Nigeria and training and other aid that was offered. So I think it highlights the extent to which I think the one legacy of colonialism has been legal systems that from a local perspective may be to a significant degree ineffective. And I think that's something that needs, as part of a legal reform process, needs to be attended to. And also there needs to be more consistency between different elements of the legal system. And that is something I think that hasn't been addressed, but I think it's a fantastic question. And I think more attention needs to be paid to that. I talk about it briefly in the book, but I think it's a key legal issue for when we think about the effectiveness of legal systems more generally.
Thank you so much, Funmi, and thank you all for your contributions. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. In the comment section, you will notice that if you would like a copy of the book, you are welcome to go on to cambridge.org with the discount code that is Disrupt 2021. That is valid until the 30th of April. You can just look there in the chat. And thank you so much for joining this joint launch by HUMA and the IMTFI. I'd like to just briefly ask Jenny and Divine to just tell us a bit more about this collaboration between HUMA and IMTFI, which I think is very pertinent in this research in technopolitics and money. Jenny?
Oh, well, just really quickly, I just want to, give a huge thank you to our panelists, Funmi, Reuters, and Bill. What a day of intellectual vibrancy here. It's very exciting. And on behalf of IMTFI at UCI, I wanted to say a big thank you to HUMA and the University of Cape Town for hosting and partnering for this event. Thank you, Divine, Mini, Amina, Azah. It's such a pleasure to come together again for these rich and super important conversations. So here at IMTFI, just really quickly, I've been managing the Institute since like 2008, and we've always placed people's own perspectives at the center of the discussion, which is very much aligned with HUMA's human-centered Pan-African approach. And we look forward to more of these collaborations, especially around money, technology, and elites, and which, Bill mentioned, as part of the proposal, and Funmi had talked about. Divine, I don't know if you wanted to add a little bit more, but all I have to say is, like, it's good to see some familiar faces in the chat, participating. We look forward, and we have another collaborative book talk coming up in May 18th with Selbel Kasumba, reimagining money, Kenya and the digital finance revolution, and that's been put in the chat. But with that said, I'll let Divine finish up. But big thank you to everybody. This has been a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. I don't think there is much to add, and to thank Funmi, to thank Rogers, to thank Bill, and also colleagues who managed to put this together. So this is the launch of a collaboration between our two institutes, and we are looking forward to the future conversations that we are going to have. And just to note to colleagues who are not aware that we are currently in a kind of a mourning at UCT because of the fire which consumed parts of the campus yesterday. So a lot of academic activities were suspended for today and tomorrow, but it's really important that we continue with these activities, and just to extend our solidarity and thanks to the people who are working overnight to ensure that we continue with this academic production. So the next series is going to be on, the next in this series is in May, as we've already indicated. But the book launch at HUMA continues every Mondays from actually 4 to 5. And we have activities all through the week. Tomorrow we are launching a new series on ethical humanitarianism, which is about humanitarian and solidarity work. So we look forward to having you commune with us, in the course of this activity. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this fantastic book launch. As Divine indicated, this is an ongoing series. We have book launches and book lunches. If you follow us on Facebook and Twitter and on our website, you will see updates on our on various book launches and lunches. Previously, we launched Sanya's book, Ken Saro Wiwa's Shadow. And before that, we had Childhood in Contemporary Diasporic African Literature by Christopher Oma. And on the 26th of April, we will have Lynn Thomas's book, Beyond the Surface. So please just keep your eye on our updates, as we will be launching books throughout the series. Thank you so much to my colleagues, Divine, Azza, Amina, Sanya, and everyone in Huma.
Jenny,
IMTFI,
Bill. Jenny has been working tirelessly, she is on our feet, back. Funmi would attest that Jenny would let us sleep, So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, and I wish you all good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Good afternoon.